What if I told you that the most terrifying soldiers in Vietnam weren't American? That somewhere in the jungles of Southeast Asia, a small group of Australians became so deadly, so invisible, so utterly inhuman in their methods that the Pentagon classified everything about them for 50 years? This is the story they never wanted you to hear. A Green Beret, one of America's elite, volunteered for 11 nights with the Australian SAS. What he witnessed broke him. Not combat, not violence. Something far worse. He saw men who had stopped being soldiers and become something else. Predators. Phantoms. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, jungle ghosts, and they weren't exaggerating. These Australians moved through enemy camps without making a single sound. They entered defended positions like smoke through a screen door. They didn't just eliminate their enemies, they destroyed their minds, leaving survivors so terrified they abandoned weapons and fled into the jungle. And the American military? They buried every word of it. Why? Because the truth was too disturbing. Because Australian kill ratios were 500 to 1. Because their methods worked so well that acknowledging them would mean admitting American tactics were failing. Because what these men learned to do exists in a gray zone that no government wants to explain. The Green Beret who witnessed all this spent the rest of his life haunted by what he saw. He couldn't sleep in a bed. He sat in chairs facing the door with a weapon within reach. He taught his children to move silently through the house. His marriage collapsed. His career ended. And his psychiatric files were so sensitive that the Australian government demanded they be reclassified. What did he see in those 11 nights? What methods did the Australians use that were too effective to acknowledge and too dark to teach? What happens when soldiers stop fighting a war and start hunting humans like prey? Stay with me until the end, because what I'm about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about special operations, about our closest allies, and about what men are capable of becoming when they embrace the darkness. This is the story of the Night Hunters, and it starts now. The jungle swallowed light like a living thing, and Staff Sergeant Michael Brennan would never forget the moment he realized the Australians beside him had stopped being soldiers and become something else entirely. It was March of 1968, deep in Phuoc Tuy province, and the American Green Beret had volunteered for a joint patrol that would shatter everything he believed about warfare, about allies, and about the thin line separating hunter from hunted. The men from the Australian Special Air Service Regiment moved through the darkness without sound, without light, without what Brennan recognized as humanity. But what he witnessed over the next 11 nights would follow him into psychiatric wards, into divorce courts, and into the bottle that eventually claimed his career. The official record shows that Brennan requested immediate extraction on day 12 and was denied. The classified debriefing that followed was sealed for 50 years, and when portions finally leaked through a Freedom of Information request in 2019, military historians were stunned by what they contained. The American Special Forces community had long whispered about Australian methods in Vietnam, about kill ratios that seemed statistically impossible, about patrols that returned with intelligence no interrogation could have produced. And this was merely the first layer of a secret the Pentagon had buried for decades. Now, through Brennan's fractured testimony, the world would finally understand how the SAS earned their terrifying reputation among the Viet Cong, who called them, quote, "one, the phantoms of the jungle." What follows is a reconstruction of those 11 nights, pieced together from declassified documents, interviews with surviving participants, and the personal journals that Brennan's family released after his passing in 2017. It is a story of tactical brilliance and psychological warfare, of methods so effective they were buried, and of one American soldier who discovered that his closest allies fought a war he never imagined possible. The nightmare began with a handshake that felt like a warning. Captain David Dusty Morrison of 3 Squadron, Australian SAS, stood barely 5 feet 8 inches tall, with sun-bleached hair and eyes that had seen things they would never discuss in polite company. When Brennan arrived at the Australian Task Force headquarters in Nui Dat, Morrison studied him the way a butcher examines livestock, measuring, calculating, finding him wanting before a single word was exchanged. The Americans had sent observers before, Morrison noted, and they had all requested extraction within 72 hours. Brennan assured him that Green Berets were made of sterner stuff, Morrison smiled in a way that contained no warmth whatsoever and told Brennan he was welcome to prove it. That smile, Brennan would later write, should have been his first warning. It was the smile of a man who knew exactly what was coming and found dark amusement in watching others stumble toward it unprepared. But the first real shock came before they even left the wire. Brennan had packed for a 3-day patrol, standard American doctrine for long-range reconnaissance. When he saw the Australians preparing for 11 days in the bush with packs that weighed less than half of his own, he assumed they were dangerously under-equipped. Morrison explained, with the patience of a man addressing a slow child, that everything Brennan carried was designed for American-style warfare, which meant firefights, helicopter extraction, and the assumption that noise was acceptable. The Australians operated by entirely different rules. They carried no sea rations, only rice and dried fish purchased from local villages. They brought no spare ammunition beyond what they could fire in a single engagement. They packed no radios for the first 8 days, maintaining complete electronic silence that would make them invisible to Viet Cong signal intercept units. This was madness by American standards, and Brennan said so. Morrison's response cut deeper than any insult. He noted that American methods had produced exactly one major victory in 3 years of combat, while Australian SAS had achieved a confirmed elimination ratio of over 500 to 1. The Americans called in airstrikes and artillery. The Australians simply disappeared into the jungle and emerged with results that no amount of firepower could match. Brennan could follow their methods exactly, Morrison concluded, or he could return to his comfortable firebase and continue wondering why the war was being lost. What choice did he have but to follow? The patrol departed at 1700 hours, moving into the fading light. What struck Brennan immediately was the complete absence of tactical formation, as he understood it. American patrols moved in defined patterns: point man, slack man, team leader, rear security, with specified distances between each element. The Australians flowed like water, sometimes clustered so close they could touch, sometimes spread across 50 meters of jungle with no visible connection. They communicated in a language he had never seen in any training manual. Hand signals, eye movements, subtle shifts in posture. A private vocabulary developed over years of shared operations. Within 30 minutes, Brennan had lost sight of every other member of the patrol and was fighting panic in the undergrowth. His heart hammered against his ribs. Sweat poured down his face despite the cooling evening air. Every shadow seemed to contain threats he could not identify. Then a hand appeared on his shoulder from nowhere. Morrison's face materialized inches from his own, and Brennan nearly screamed before catching himself. The Australian had moved 15 meters through dense vegetation, without producing a single sound that Brennan's highly trained ears could detect. How was that possible? Green Berets spent months learning silent movement techniques. They practiced on courses designed to detect the slightest noise. They considered themselves masters of stealth warfare. Morrison had just demonstrated that everything they knew was inadequate. The Australian pointed toward a slight depression in the jungle floor and indicated that Brennan should follow exactly in his footsteps, placing his boots in the precise locations where Morrison's had fallen. The lesson was clear without words. Every step the Americans took announced their presence to enemies who had spent a lifetime learning to read the jungle. The Australians had unlearned everything Western soldiers thought they knew about movement and replaced it with something older. But the real education was only beginning. On the second night, Brennan witnessed something that would appear in his psychiatric evaluations for decades. The patrol had stopped in a thicket so dense that he could barely see his own hands, and the Australians had arranged themselves in a formation he did not recognize. They were not sleeping, not standing watch in any conventional sense. They were simply present, merged with the darkness in a way that made them indistinguishable from the vegetation around them. One operator remained motionless for over 4 hours without shifting position. Brennan timed it on his watch, convinced that the man must be sleeping with his eyes open. But when a gecko rustled through leaves 20 meters away, the operator's head turned fractionally toward the sound, then returned to its original position. He was awake, alert, and utterly still in a way that no American training had ever produced. This was not normal human capability, Brennan thought. These men had trained themselves to become something else, something that occupied the space between soldier and predator. He found himself wondering what else they had learned that American special forces had never imagined possible. The answer came on the third night, and it haunted him forever. The patrol located a Viet Cong supply cache hidden beneath a seemingly unremarkable section of jungle floor. American doctrine called for marking the location, withdrawing to a safe distance, and calling in an airstrike that would destroy the supplies along with approximately 3 acres of surrounding terrain. Brennan expected Morrison to reach for the radio he knew was buried somewhere in the patrol's equipment. Instead, Morrison smiled that cold smile again. The Australians would not destroy the cache, he explained through gestures and whispered fragments. They would study it, memorize its contents, note which trails led to and from it. And then they would wait. Brennan asked what they were waiting for, and Morrison's answer would echo through his nightmares for 50 years. They were waiting for the men who would come to retrieve the supplies. When those men arrived, the SAS would not engage them in conventional combat. They would follow them, learn their routes, identify their base camps. Only then would they strike. But not with the gunfire and explosions that characterized American operations. The Australians preferred methods that left no evidence of their presence, that made their enemies believe they were being hunted by spirits rather than soldiers. They called this practice, quote, 3. And what it involved made Brennan's stomach turn with a mixture of horror and fascination that he could never fully separate. The Australians did not merely patrol the jungle. They stalked it, claimed it, made it their hunting ground in a way that reversed every assumption about who was predator and who was prey. The first target appeared on day 5, just before dawn. A young Viet Cong courier approached the cache alone, checking his surroundings with the casual confidence of a man who believed himself unobserved. Brennan expected the Australians to capture him for interrogation or eliminate him silently and move on. Standard special operations procedure, maximum intelligence extraction with minimum exposure. What happened instead defied everything he thought he knew about warfare. 2 SAS operators melted into the jungle behind the courier and followed him for over 6 hours, tracking his route, noting every contact he made, mapping a network that no prisoner could have revealed under any interrogation. They moved through the same terrain as their target without once alerting him to their presence. They passed within meters of other Viet Cong and remained undetected. They became invisible in a way that American training had never achieved. When the courier finally reached his destination, the Australians had documented 7 previously unknown supply points. They had identified 3 weapons caches, the location of a regional Viet Cong headquarters that had eluded American search and destroy operations for 18 months, and the daily routines of over 40 enemy personnel. All without firing a shot. All without the target ever suspecting he had led hunters directly to his sanctuary. But this intelligence, remarkable as it was, represented only the beginning. Morrison was not satisfied with merely locating the enemy infrastructure. He wanted to destroy it in a way that would break enemy morale across the entire province. He wanted to demonstrate that the jungle offered no protection, that the Viet Cong were not the masters of this terrain they believed themselves to be. He wanted to teach them fear. On the 7th night, the Australians initiated what they called a ghost strike, and Brennan witnessed the method that earned them their fearsome reputation throughout Vietnam. The patrol approached the newly discovered headquarters through terrain so dense that movement was measured in meters per hour. They arrived at the perimeter just before midnight and spent 3 hours simply watching, counting sentries, memorizing patrol patterns, identifying which structures housed leadership and which contained common soldiers. American forces would have called for helicopter gunships and turned the entire compound into a crater. Fast, violent, overwhelming. The American way of war. Firepower substituting for finesse. Destruction measuring success. Brennan waited for Morrison to call in coordinates for an airstrike. What he saw instead changed his understanding of warfare permanently. The Australians entered the compound without firing a single shot. Brennan later described the experience as watching 5 shadows detach from the darkness and flow through the enemy perimeter like smoke through a screen door. The Viet Cong had established a watch rotation that American intelligence would have considered adequate, with sentries posted at 30-meter intervals around the compound and roving patrols crossing every 15 minutes. The Australians found gaps that existed for mere seconds between each coverage overlap. They identified these gaps within an hour of observation. They exploited them with precision that bordered on supernatural. They moved through a defended enemy position as if the defenders did not exist, as if the entire security apparatus was an illusion designed to comfort rather than protect. What happened next would become the central trauma of Brennan's psychiatric treatment. The SAS operators did not simply eliminate the enemy leadership in their sleep. They conducted what Morrison later described in the single interview he ever gave on the subject as, quote, 5. The details of this preparation were never officially documented, but Brennan's testimony provided fragments that suggested methods designed to break enemy morale on a fundamental level. The Australians left signs of their presence that could not be explained by any conventional military action. Signs that suggested the jungle itself had turned against the Viet Cong. Signs that implied spirits from beyond the grave had returned to punish those who served the communist cause. They arranged objects in patterns that carried deep meaning in Vietnamese spiritual tradition. Patterns that no Western soldier should have known. Patterns that whispered of curses and hauntings and supernatural vengeance. The morning after the ghost strike, Brennan saw the results with his own eyes. The Viet Cong compound had not been destroyed. It had been violated in ways that defied military explanation. Leadership structures stood empty, their occupants gone without evidence of violence that local forces could understand. Personal effects had been arranged in configurations that spoke to Vietnamese fears older than communism, older than colonialism, older than any ideology. The surviving Viet Cong were not mourning their fallen comrades. They were fleeing in terror from a place they believed had been cursed. Brennan watched through binoculars as hardened guerrilla fighters abandoned weapons, supplies, months of careful preparation, running from an enemy they could not see, could not fight, could not understand. The Australians had accomplished more with 5 men and no ammunition expenditure than an American battalion could have achieved with unlimited air support, and they had done it by weaponizing fear itself. Morrison explained the philosophy behind these methods during the patrol's extraction phase, and his words revealed a tactical doctrine that American forces never officially acknowledged. The Americans believed in body counts, in destruction that could be measured and reported to headquarters hungry for statistics. The Australians understood that the real war was fought in the minds of their enemies. A single terrified survivor who spread stories of jungle spirits was worth more than 100 confirmed eliminations that merely created martyrs. The SAS did not just remove enemy combatants. They removed the enemy's will to fight, their belief that resistance was possible, their confidence that the jungle offered any protection. They broke something deeper than bodies. They broke souls. But there was more, and this is where the story becomes truly disturbing. Brennan's declassified testimony includes references to practices that the Australian government has never acknowledged, and American officials have worked systematically to suppress. The quote, 6 ritual, where SAS operators would remove the boots from eliminated enemies and leave them arranged in specific patterns. The use of Aboriginal tracking techniques that allowed the Australians to read the jungle like a printed page. These were not skills any Western military academy taught. The trackers attached to SAS patrols came from communities whose ancestors had hunted across the Australian outback for 40,000 years. They perceived signs invisible to European eyes: a bent blade of grass, a disturbed insect nest, the faint impression of a footprint on ground that looked untouched. They could determine how many men had passed, how long ago, whether they were carrying loads, whether they were tired or alert. And they taught these skills to young Australians who would never have learned them otherwise. Sheep farmers from Queensland, factory workers from Melbourne, surfers from Bondi Beach. Men with no connection to Indigenous tradition, who nonetheless learned to perceive the world through ancient eyes, to track human prey with methods developed over millennia of survival in harsh environments. The transformation this produced was profound and disturbing. Brennan watched an operator named Collins, a former lifeguard from Sydney, identify a Viet Cong trail that Brennan could not see even when Collins pointed directly at it. The Australian explained that the leaves were wrong, that sunlight was hitting them at angles that indicated recent disturbance, that the insects in that area were behaving differently than those in the surrounding jungle. It was like watching a man read a language written in colors invisible to other eyes. Collins had spent 6 months training with Aboriginal trackers before his deployment, learning to see what 40,000 years of hunting tradition had discovered about reading the land. Now he applied that knowledge to tracking human beings. and the results were devastating for anyone who became his target. The Green Berets had considered themselves the elite of American special operations. They had trained in the swamps of Florida, the mountains of North Carolina, the jungles of Panama. They had learned survival, evasion, resistance, and escape from the best instructors the American military could produce. They had been told, repeatedly and with absolute confidence, that they represented the finest unconventional warfare capability on Earth. In 11 nights, Michael Brennan learned that everything he believed was a comfortable lie. The Australians had achieved something American training could not replicate because American training still assumed that soldiers were civilized men performing necessary violence. The Australian approach abandoned this assumption entirely. They understood that the jungle was not a battlefield, but a hunting ground, that the enemy was not an opposing army, but prey to be stalked, isolated, and harvested. This mental framework produced capabilities American forces could not match. Combat implies two forces meeting in contest, with each side possessing some chance of victory. Hunting implies a predator and prey with no possibility of equal engagement. The Australians had decided which role they would play, and they had trained accordingly. The aftermath of Brennan's patrol became a classified case study in inter-allied intelligence. Pentagon analysts had long suspected that Australian SAS kill ratios were inflated, that Commonwealth forces were padding their statistics to secure continued American support. When Brennan returned with testimony of methods that could not be quantified through normal metrics, that produced strategic effects without generating reportable body counts, the American military establishment faced an uncomfortable truth. The Australians were not exaggerating their effectiveness. They were understating it because the full scope of their methods could never be officially acknowledged without raising questions that no government wanted to answer. What questions specifically troubled the Pentagon brass? The first concerned the Geneva Conventions and the laws of warfare as understood by Western democracies. The psychological operations employed by Australian SAS existed in a gray zone no military lawyer wanted to examine. The methods did not technically violate the letter of international law. There was no torture, no mistreatment of prisoners, no targeting of civilian populations. But the spirit of the law assumed that warfare would be conducted by soldiers who identified themselves as soldiers, who fought in ways their enemies could understand and predict. The Australians had abandoned these assumptions entirely. The results were devastatingly effective and profoundly troubling. The second question concerned what American forces could have learned if inter-allied rivalry had not prevented honest knowledge transfer. Brennan's testimony revealed that multiple American units had requested Australian SAS training and been denied. Not by the Australians, but by American commanders who could not accept that their methods required fundamental revision. Pride had cost American lives, and the documents proved it. The Green Berets, the Navy SEALs, the Phuoc reconnaissance teams, all had developed their own doctrines based on American assumptions about firepower, mobility, and the acceptable duration of patrol operations. The Australian approach challenged these assumptions at every level. American ego could not accommodate the implications. The third question was the most troubling of all, and it remains unanswered today. What psychological transformation was required to produce operators capable of the methods Brennan witnessed? The Australian SAS recruited from a population less than 1/20th the size of America's, yet they produced soldiers who outperformed their American counterparts by every meaningful metric. Selection was brutal. Fewer than 15% of candidates survived the initial assessment. Many who passed the physical challenges were eliminated for psychological unsuitability. But what exactly made a man suitable for this kind of warfare? What quality allowed some men to embrace the darkness, while others broke under its weight? Brennan believed he understood, and his explanation disturbed American military psychologists for decades. The Australians did not train men to suppress their hunting instincts. They cultivated those instincts, refined them, connected them to ancient traditions of stalking and survival that European settlers had nearly erased, but Aboriginal advisors could still teach. The SAS operators Brennan accompanied had spent months training with trackers whose ancestors had hunted across the Australian outback for 40,000 years. They had learned to become predators in a way that no Western military training could replicate. Because Western military training still assumed that soldiers were civilized men performing necessary violence. The Australians had abandoned civilization in favor of something older, darker, and infinitely more effective. But Michael Brennan was no longer concerned with operational effectiveness. The Green Beret had returned from his patrol fundamentally changed, and not in ways that the Army's psychological screening could easily categorize. He had not witnessed conventional combat trauma. No friends had fallen beside him, no wounds had been suffered, no atrocities had been committed against innocent civilians. What Brennan experienced was something more subtle and perhaps more damaging. A complete revision of his understanding of what soldiers could become when they fully committed to the methods of war. His first psychiatric evaluation noted symptoms inconsistent with standard combat stress reactions. Brennan did not startle at loud noises or experience flashbacks triggered by environmental stimuli. Instead, he reported persistent unease and darkness, a sensation of being watched that he attributed not to paranoia, but to a newly developed awareness that darkness could conceal threats invisible to untrained perception. He found himself unable to walk through wooded areas without reading the ground for signs of passage, a skill he had observed but never mastered. He dreamed not of violence but of silence, of movement through spaces where sound itself became an enemy. The Army classified his condition as "7" and recommended administrative leave. But Brennan knew that what he experienced was not exhaustion. It was awakening to a reality that most soldiers would never confront, a reality where the rules of warfare, as taught in Western military academies, were revealed as comfortable fictions. The Australians had shown him what humans could become when limitations were removed. His subsequent career reflected the damage of this knowledge. Brennan served 2 more tours in Vietnam, requesting assignments that kept him as far as possible from Australian units. He could not explain this avoidance to superiors, who saw cooperation with Commonwealth allies as professionally advantageous. He could not describe what he had witnessed without raising questions about his own sanity. He could only ensure that he never again found himself in the darkness with men who had learned to make that darkness their ally. The nightmares began in 1971, 3 years after the patrol, and they never stopped. They were not the violent dreams that combat veterans typically reported. Brennan did not relive firefights or witness the faces of fallen enemies. Instead, he dreamed of the jungle at night, of silence so complete that his own heartbeat seemed deafening, of shadows that moved with purpose and precision toward prey that could not see them coming. He would wake convinced that he was being watched, that the skills he had observed in Morrison's operators had followed him home. His marriage ended in 1973. Shortly after his medical discharge. His wife testified during proceedings that Brennan had become unable to sleep in a bed, preferring to spend nights sitting in a chair facing the door with a weapon within reach. He had insisted on removing all sources of artificial light from their home, claiming that true darkness was preferable to the false security of illumination. The children had been the final breaking point. He had taught them to move silently through the house, conducting exercises they did not understand, but which filled them with unease. She had finally left when she discovered him practicing knife techniques in the basement at 3 in the morning. Techniques he admitted he had never been trained to perform, but which came to him in dreams. The Veterans Administration documented Brennan's case as one of the most unusual in their psychiatric archives. Standard treatment for combat-related psychological conditions assumed that trauma resulted from experiencing or committing violence. Brennan's condition seemed to result from witnessing efficiency, from observing methods so effective they revealed conventional warfare as a crude and wasteful enterprise. His therapist struggled with a question that had no precedent. How do you treat a man traumatized not by horror, but by excellence, not by atrocity, but by competence that approached art? The answer, it turned out, was that you could not treat him. You could only help him manage symptoms that would never fully resolve. Declassified records show that the Australian government contacted American authorities in 1979. The Australians had become aware that details of SAS methods were appearing in Brennan's psychiatric records and potentially in his conversations with other veterans. They requested, through diplomatic channels, that the American government take steps to ensure operational security regarding techniques that remained in active use. The implications of this request were staggering. The methods Brennan had witnessed were not historical artifacts. They were still being taught, still being employed, still producing operators capable of the things he had observed. Somewhere in Australia, young men were learning to become what Morrison's patrol had become, learning to move through darkness like predators, learning to weaponize fear, A compromise was reached wherein Brennan's most detailed testimony was reclassified. His treatment was transferred to a facility with enhanced security protocols. The official explanation was that his condition required specialized care. The real reason was that his knowledge had become a national security concern for two allied governments. But the story had already begun to spread through veteran communities. By the early 1980s, rumors of Australian SAS methods had become a persistent thread in special operations folklore. American operators who had served alongside Australian units traded stories of techniques they had witnessed but could not replicate. The _8_ concept, the psychological warfare methods, the aboriginal tracking integration, these became subjects of intense professional curiosity. Some of these curious soldiers would later reshape American special operations entirely. Veterans of Vietnam who had observed Australian methods became instructors at Fort Bragg, at Coronado, at the Army's School of the Americas. They could not officially credit Australian doctrine as the source of their innovations, but the influence was unmistakable. The extended patrol concept that became standard in modern special operations. Australian. The emphasis on psychological effects over body counts. Australian. The integration of indigenous knowledge into tactical operations. Australian. American Special Forces had learned from their Commonwealth cousins after all. They had simply never admitted where the lessons came from. The debt remained unpaid, unacknowledged, buried in classified files and veteran whispers. Michael Brennan did not live to see this transformation. He passed in 2017 at a Veterans Administration hospital in Arizona, still haunted by dreams of silent movement through hostile terrain. His family released his journals the following year, and their publication generated renewed interest in the classified relationship between Australian SAS and American Special Operations during the Vietnam era. Researchers discovered that Brennan's experience was not unique. Other American observers had been similarly affected by exposure to Australian methods, though most had been more successfully silenced. Some had thrived, incorporating what they learned into distinguished careers. Others had broken, unable to process what they had witnessed. The Australians themselves remained largely silent. Official histories of the Australian SAS in Vietnam emphasize conventional reconnaissance and counter-guerrilla operations. They credit Australian success to superior training, physical conditioning, and small unit leadership rather than psychological warfare methods that might raise uncomfortable questions. The men who served in those patrols have maintained their silence for 50 years, bound by official secrecy requirements, bound by unit loyalty, bound perhaps by a recognition that some knowledge is better left unshared with a world that would not understand it and could not handle its implications. But the evidence continues to surface through unexpected channels. Viet Cong veterans interviewed in the 1990s and 2000s consistently described Australian forces as fundamentally different from their American counterparts. They used terms translated as "9", "10", "11", to characterize enemies who seemed to operate outside the normal rules of warfare. Several described incidents consistent with the methods Brennan witnessed: targeted strikes that left no evidence, psychological effects that demoralized entire units, an apparent ability to move through the jungle without detection that defied physical explanation. These accounts painted a picture of capabilities that official histories never acknowledged and military professionals still debate. The tactical lessons of this history remain relevant today. Modern special operations forces face enemies in environments ranging from Afghan mountains to African savannas to the urban jungles of megacity slums. The fundamental principles that made Australian SAS so effective in Vietnam: patience, psychological warfare, integration of local knowledge, willingness to operate beyond the boundaries of conventional military thinking, apply wherever unconventional warfare is conducted. Yet these lessons remain controversial, officially discouraged, taught through whispered tradition rather than formal doctrine. Perhaps this is appropriate. The methods that Michael Brennan witnessed were effective precisely because they existed outside official sanction, because they represented individual operators' willingness to embrace approaches that their governments could not publicly endorse. If these techniques became official doctrine, they would lose their power. They would be codified, regulated, constrained by the same bureaucratic processes that made American operations in Vietnam so predictably ineffective. The Australian advantage came not from superior equipment or resources, but from a willingness to let small groups of highly trained men operate according to their own judgment in the darkness. This is what haunted Michael Brennan until the end of his days. Not the specific techniques he had witnessed, which were brutal, but no more so than the methods employed by all sides in that brutal war. What haunted him was the recognition that somewhere, in the training compounds of allied nations, men were still learning to become what he had seen the Australians become. They were still unlearning the comfortable assumptions of civilized warfare. They were still replacing those assumptions with older, darker knowledge. They were still discovering that the difference between soldier and hunter was a choice, and some men were choosing to become predators in ways that most of their countrymen would never understand. The legacy of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam extends far beyond tactical innovation. The transformation of ordinary Australians into the operators that Brennan encountered began long before they set foot in Vietnamese jungles. Selection for the Special Air Service Regiment was designed not merely to identify physical excellence, but to locate men with a particular psychological profile that standard military assessments could not measure. The regiment wanted men who could function in complete isolation, men who could maintain operational focus without the reassurance of radio contact or the promise of rapid extraction. Men who could adapt their methods to circumstances that training could not fully anticipate. Men who possessed a certain darkness that civilized society preferred not to acknowledge. This selection process produced casualties that never appeared in any official statistics. Candidates who failed physically returned to conventional units with nothing worse than bruised pride. Candidates who failed psychologically often required extensive counseling before they could return to any form of military service. They had glimpsed something during assessment that their minds could not process, an expectation of capability that revealed their own limitations in ways they found devastating. The survivors emerged with a bond forged not through shared danger, but through shared transformation, a recognition that they had crossed a threshold most soldiers would never approach. Training that followed selection built on this psychological foundation. The regiment maintained relationships with Aboriginal communities whose tracking traditions predated European settlement by tens of thousands of years. These advisors taught skills that no Western military establishment had ever formally incorporated. The ability to read ground sign that urban eyes would miss entirely. Methods for moving through terrain without disturbing the natural environment. Techniques for remaining motionless for hours while remaining alert and combat-ready. The young men who absorbed this training emerged changed in ways that medical science could not fully explain. One former instructor, speaking decades after his retirement, described the training philosophy in terms that illuminate Brennan's experiences. The Western military tradition assumed that combat was fundamentally unnatural, that soldiers had to be conditioned to overcome innate resistance to lethal violence. The regiment rejected this assumption entirely. Humans were predators by evolutionary heritage. The artificial constraints of civilization had merely suppressed instincts that remained fully functional. Their training did not create new capabilities. It removed limitations that society had imposed, allowing natural predatory capacity to emerge. This philosophical foundation produced capabilities that seemed almost supernatural. When Michael Brennan saw the Australians flow through enemy territory without producing detectable sound, he was witnessing the result of training that had reconnected modern soldiers with capabilities their species had developed over millions of years. The American approach relied on technology and firepower to compensate for civilized disadvantages. The Australian approach eliminated those disadvantages entirely. They trained men to become effective predators themselves, to access instincts that Western civilization had suppressed but never destroyed. The implications troubled military ethicists who learned of these methods through leaked documents and veteran testimony. Warfare in the Western tradition was supposed to be conducted by soldiers who retained their humanity, soldiers who fought reluctantly and returned to civilian life when conflict ended. The Australian approach seemed to produce something different, men who had accessed aspects of human nature that civilization had worked to suppress, who had become comfortable with predatory psychology in ways that might not be easily reversed. Were these still soldiers in any meaningful sense? Or had they become something the Geneva Conventions never anticipated? The question arose most urgently in discussions of reintegration following combat deployments. American veterans of Vietnam struggled with well-documented difficulties adjusting to civilian life. Psychologists attributed these difficulties to the trauma of combat exposure. Australian SAS veterans displayed different patterns that puzzled researchers unfamiliar with their training background. They did not typically exhibit the hypervigilance, flashback intrusion, and emotional numbing that characterized American combat stress. Instead, they reported a restless dissatisfaction with civilian environments. A sense that something essential had been awakened during their service that peacetime existence could not satisfy. Several former operators described this experience in terms that echoed Brennan's haunted journals. Once you learned to see the world as a predator sees it, ordinary life seemed flattened. The heightened awareness that made them so effective in the jungle became a burden in environments where no genuine threats existed. They found themselves reading crowds for potential dangers, analyzing terrain for ambush possibilities, maintaining a state of alertness that civilian circumstances did not require. Their transformed psychology could not simply switch off. The Australian government's response to these challenges remained classified until recently. Reintegration programs for SAS veterans included counseling approaches found nowhere else in military psychology. Approaches designed to help operators manage rather than eliminate the changes their training had produced. The assumption was that complete return to pre-service psychological states was neither possible nor desirable. The men had become something valuable, and the challenge was helping them find constructive applications for capabilities that had been developed for warfare but might serve other purposes in peacetime. Some found these applications in law enforcement, in security consulting, in wilderness rescue operations. Others struggled permanently with the disconnect between what they had become and what civilian society expected. The suicide rate among Australian SAS veterans exceeded that of conventional forces by margins that officials preferred not to publicize. This is the human cost of tactical excellence that official histories never acknowledge. Michael Brennan encountered something similar in the American veterans he met during his decades of treatment. The men most deeply affected by Vietnam were not necessarily those who had witnessed the worst violence or suffered the most devastating losses. They were men who had glimpsed possibilities for human transformation. Like Brennan, they had seen what soldiers could become when conventional limitations were removed. This knowledge had proved more difficult to process than any specific trauma, more persistent than any memory of violence. The modern special operations community inherits this complicated legacy. Contemporary training incorporates many techniques that trace their origins to Australian innovations in Vietnam, though the intellectual genealogy is rarely acknowledged. The extended patrol concept, the emphasis on psychological effects, the integration of indigenous knowledge, these principles now appear in special operations doctrine worldwide. They remain disconnected from their origins in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy province. Yet the fundamental questions that Brennan's experience raised remain unanswered. What are the limits of transformation that military training should attempt? How do societies manage warriors whose capabilities exceed what peacetime can constructively employ? Is the effectiveness demonstrated by Australian SAS worth the psychological costs? These questions receive no attention in official histories that celebrated body counts and mission accomplishments. They matter only to the men who lived with the consequences and the families who watched them struggle. The darkness that swallowed light in Vietnamese jungles continues to swallow lives. Michael Brennan understood this better than most because he had witnessed the transformation without experiencing it himself. He had seen what the Australians became without becoming it, and this liminal position left him neither soldier nor civilian, neither predator nor prey. He spent 50 years processing an 11-night education his American training never prepared him to receive. His final years were spent in a veterans facility, where staff learned not to approach his room without announcing themselves. He had installed motion sensors that alerted him to movement in the corridor, modifications the facility permitted after learning his history. He slept in a chair facing the door, a habit he developed in the 70s and never abandoned. He ate meals alone at a table positioned against the wall, where no one could approach from behind. The staff who worked with him described a man who was perfectly lucid, often charming in conversation, but permanently configured for an environment that no longer existed. The jungle was 40 years and 10,000 miles away. But for Michael Brennan, it had never ended. When researchers approached him in 2015 about contributing to a documentary on Australian SAS methods, He declined with an explanation that captured his experience more eloquently than any formal testimony. His words deserve to be remembered. Quote 12. He told the filmmaker. Quote 13. The documentary was never completed, but the filmmaker's notes survived. Multiple veterans from various nations had similar stories. Encounters with Australian SAS operators that left them questioning everything they thought they knew about warfare. A British observer described watching an Australian patrol extract intelligence from an enemy position without ever making contact, using methods he could not explain. A New Zealand soldier recalled training alongside Australians whose capabilities exceeded anything his own elite unit could match. An American Marine remembered an Australian sergeant who could locate enemy positions by smell alone, detecting cooking fires and human habitation from distances that seemed impossible. These accounts painted a picture of capabilities that official histories never acknowledged. Skeptics argued that the stories reflected natural tendencies to exaggerate Allied competence. Believers countered that consistency across decades and nationalities suggested something more than myth. The truth likely lies somewhere between these positions. The exact location remains classified. What is documented beyond dispute is that Australian SAS achieved operational results in Vietnam that exceeded American performance by every available metric. They suffered fewer casualties while inflicting more damage, gathered better intelligence while remaining undetected longer, and maintained morale at levels American forces could not match. Whether these achievements resulted from training, selection, or something more fundamental remains debated. Michael Brennan believed he knew the answer, and he carried that knowledge to his grave. The Australians had not merely trained differently or selected more capable personnel. They had accessed something Western military tradition had forgotten, the predatory heritage that civilization had suppressed but not eliminated. The hunter's mindset that had allowed humanity to survive and dominate hostile environments for millions of years before agriculture and cities made it unnecessary. Their training reconnected modern men with ancient capabilities. The results were simultaneously magnificent and terrifying. This is the hidden history of the Vietnam War that official accounts will never acknowledge. Not the body counts or strategic analyses, not the political debates or diplomatic negotiations, but the quiet transformation of ordinary men into something their enemies feared and their allies could not fully understand. The Australians who served in those jungles returned to sheep stations and suburbs, carrying knowledge they rarely discussed. They had learned what humans could become when pushed beyond the boundaries civilization maintained. And somewhere in the darkness of a veterans' hospital in Arizona, a man who had witnessed their transformation spent his final days watching the door. He was waiting for something he could not name to emerge from shadows that never fully lifted. "I saw what they did in the dark," Michael Brennan wrote, "and in those 8 words lies a history the Pentagon buried, the Australian government denied, and the men who lived it have mostly chosen to forget. But the darkness remembers. It always does. The jungle swallows light like a living thing, and in the darkness, hunters still move toward their prey. They do not make sound. They do not leave traces. They do not fight according to rules their enemies can anticipate. They have learned what Michael Brennan learned in 11 Nights with the Australian SAS, that warfare at its most effective is not about firepower or technology or numerical superiority. It is about will, about training, about the willingness to become something that most men cannot imagine. Somewhere tonight, in training compounds whose locations are classified and whose methods are officially denied, other men are learning to become that something else. And the darkness is waiting to receive them.